Florida had executed an inmate by injecting a lethal drug which has never been used before in the United States. 53-year-old Marcus A. was convicted of 2 murders in 1988. He made no last statement and showed no indication of showing pain during the execution.
Well, the company that invented the drug says regulatory authorities have not okayed the drug for this purpose, and they said they do not condone its use in lethal injections. A state's attorney argued the drug would result in too much pain for his client, but the Florida Supreme Court turned down his motion to block the execution. With us now, defense attorney Ambrosio Rodriguez. Ambrosio, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
This is a case that is raising concerns on several fronts. Let's work through them. First of all, let's start with the fact that one of the drugs used in the execution cocktail, if you will, a 3-drug cocktail, had never been used before in this setting. This drug called etomidate. It's supposed to act as an anesthetic, as we understand it. You have said that the decision to go ahead and use it, despite the lack of information about it, is selfish-serving. What do you mean by that?
Right, it's self-serving in the fact that it was the Florida Department of Corrections who was in charge of, administering the lethal injection that decided that it was safe enough to use. So this was done without the medical community approving it. The problem is that a lethal injection has 3 parts to it, right? The anesthesia, then the one that causes paralysis, and one that causes the heart to stop. We have come to the point in our society where the medical community is no longer getting itself involved in approving through whatever kind of medical scientific means of these types of drugs in lethal injections. The American Medical Association and groups like that do not want to be a part of it, just like pharmaceutical companies are no longer selling these drugs to the states where the death penalty is still legal. So it's kind of, there's nowhere, in order for a state to use lethal injection, they have to go this route where they are administering a lethal injection without scientific or medical approval.
I want you to take a listen to what the prison spokesperson said about the execution and how it was carried out. Take a listen.
This is the department's most solemn duty. The foremost objective of the lethal injection procedure is a humane and dignified process. The Department of Corrections follows the law to carry out the sentence of the court as laid out in Florida statute, which is what was done this evening.
So you're saying there were no complications at all?
That's correct. There were no complications.
Okay, so here's the thing. She says there were no complications at all, but you cannot say with certainty, right, that Marcus A. was not in pain, because there is a drug administered that brings on paralysis. So he could have been, they just couldn't tell.
Absolutely.
But then again, let's say he did die peacefully, if you will, for want of a better word. There's no certainty that this drug used on somebody else would not have complications.
Right, and there's no way to know. This is kind of an unknown thing that we could very well end up in a situation where 2, 3, 4 executions from now in Florida, Oklahoma, or Texas, where the other state they're thinking of using the same protocol, they could have the complications where you have, for lack of a better word, kind of a grisly death. I mean, it is a very strange conversation to have, or dialogue to have in public, as to how to painfully or unpainfully kill someone, right? Because that's really what we're talking about. So it seems that we are kind of an impasse, a stalemate in this kind of very heated issue in this country as to whether we should have a death penalty or not. And now with kind of the medical and scientific community getting involved by taking themselves out of it, states have to kind of make these decisions as to how to go forward. And I think it's going to be debated and kind of be on the news for a very long time.
I want to ask you whether you think that Marcus A.'s constitutional rights were breached in this case, given the way the death penalty was imposed here, that it was the jury broke 9-3 for finding him guilty, but the actual death penalty was imposed by a judge. We know the Supreme Court in 2016 ruled that unconstitutional, that basically in Florida the judges had too much power. And yet the Supreme Court didn't get to weigh in on the constitutionality of Marcus A.'s situation a second time, if you will.
Right.
Were his rights violated?
I think there are real issues here, because in a death penalty case, and I've tried those cases, There are two phases. First, the jury must determine whether or not a first-degree murder occurred and whether the person is guilty. Then they make a second determination as to whether or not the person should receive death or life without the possibility of parole. Florida had a system that once the jury was deadlocked or hung in this case, the judge could make the determination of imposing death. The problem with that, as the Supreme Court said, is that the jury, this is a purview of the jury. The jury, as representatives of the community, make that determination. A judge is an elected official. They run for election every 4 or 6 years, depending on the state. That is not what we kind of had in mind, and by we, I mean the Founding Fathers, in terms of the Sixth Amendment. The problem that I have is that there's always a question as to whether or not a constitutional right is retroactive. Usually it is. So if the decision to seek death or to impose the death penalty was unconstitutional because it was 9-3 and was by the judge, there should have been further litigation and further hearings in front of a federal court as to whether or not it should apply retroactively. The only court that said that it shouldn't was the Florida Supreme Court.
That's right.
And then there's another level of litigation at the federal level, because the way it goes, it's first you go through the state level in a criminal case, and then you get to the federal courts. And I think that this is a real problem with the way this case ended up.
Yeah, there are many troubling aspects of this case. Ambrosio Rodriguez, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.